Greetings. I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. I want to welcome you to our 47th episode of the Bible study of the Gospel according to Luke. If you've come across this video randomly, welcome. I believe the Holy Spirit has called you to explore Scripture with us, and I invite you to stick with us through this session. Or you can go to my YouTube channel and you can find all of the episodes if you want to start from the beginning. But I do believe that God has called you to join us. Before we go any further, I want to thank all of the folks who have been watching faithfully. We are, with this video, 3 episodes from the end of this series. So we have been studying Luke for almost a year, and I want to just say that I hope that this has been life-giving, energizing, spiritually uplifting for you. Before we get deeply into study, if you don't have your tools in front of you, I invite you to do that. First, a Bible, translation of your choice, printed, digital, that is up to you and what you have available. Again, a piece of paper or a notepad and a pen or pencil to jot down your thoughts, your questions, your inspirations, your reflections, to doodle or draw pictures or write poetry or whatever inspires you during this time together. If you do have questions or want to share your comments, you're welcome to do so in the comments under this video. Or if you would prefer a more personal conversation, please reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end of this video. So today we are drawing close to the end of this gospel. Today we will be exploring the trials that Jesus will go through, first with the Sanhedrin or the council, but then also his time before Pilate and Herod. So I invite you to enter into this time to reflect on what God is saying to us in Luke's gospel. As I've mentioned throughout this series, there's 6 themes that run throughout Luke's gospel and also then into the book of Acts. Let me review them quickly and then we'll come back and see how they reflect on our readings for today. So first, God's redemptive purposes. Second, salvation for all alike. Third, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. Fourth, table fellowship. Fifth, the role of a disciple. And sixth, the importance of an accurate witness. So again, as I've mentioned before, we may not touch on all of those themes, but we will see what Luke is lifting up today. So Jesus has just been arrested. We're leaving the Mount of Olives and we're headed to the house of the high priest. And remember, Peter had just denied Jesus 3 times. And this is where we find ourselves in today's episode. So starting in chapter 22, verses 63 through 65, we have the mocking and beating of Jesus. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" They kept heaping many other insults on him. Now remember, this is kind of ironic because Jesus had prophesied that Peter would deny him 3 times. That prophecy just came through. So now these soldiers and captors are beating him and mocking him and trying to ridicule him by saying, "Prophesy and tell us which one of us beat you." And it's really meant to be insulting. It's meant to be humiliating. They are mocking and trying to break down Jesus. This is intentional by these people. So Luke is probably thinking these were the servants and the soldiers and the authorities that were listed in verse 52 that came to arrest Jesus. And the verbs that are used in this brief scene tie to the passion predictions and other contexts in this gospel. First, the men's cruel game is characterized as mockery. In one of the passion predictions, Jesus had warned that he would be handed over to Gentiles, mocked, insulted, and spat upon in verse 18, 32. So again, Luke is saying these words that Jesus have said before are starting to be fulfilled. This is an important part of Luke's story. So the present scene is the first of 3 occasions in Luke's passion narratives in which predictions from Jesus will ultimately be fulfilled. So Jesus is mocked before the Jewish trial, and that's where we are in chapter 22, verse 63. But also then before Herod and his soldiers in verse 23 through 11, which we'll talk about later. And then again by the soldiers at the cross in verse 23, 36, which we'll actually talk about in next episode. Here was a king who had counted the cost of what it would mean, and he still was mocked. This is Jesus fulfilling the predictions and what he knew was to come. Now Luke uses this verb to beat 5 times, more often than any other New Testament book. And 2 of the other references occurred in the parable of the wicked tenants who beat the servant sent by the owner of the vineyard. Remember that? And this parable is now being fulfilled. Jesus had told this parable in front of the scribes and the chief priests, and now they are enacting that parable with the beating of servants and ultimately the death of the son of the vineyard owner. But then we also hear this mocking, this taunting, this irony of those who are holding him captive, because Jesus is predicted, or Luke emphasizes Jesus as the greatest of all the prophets, right? He's greater than any other prophet. We hear it in the Annunciation when the angel promised that John would fulfill the role of Elijah in chapter 1, verse 17. But Jesus would be greater. So this desire and this mocking of these leaders is once again this fulfillment, this realization that Jesus is more than anyone wants to give him credit for. And then again in Luke 7, Jesus is hailed as one greater than a prophet in chapter 7, verses 18 through 35. Jesus had given repeated predictions about the killing of his passion. Jesus had given repeated predictions of the events of his passion, and they were unfolding exactly as he said they would. So he also talked about Jerusalem and its desire to kill prophets, and he would be another one. Jesus had told his disciples that one of them would betray him, and Peter would deny him. And Luke had fulfilled those predictions as well. And even the mockery of these men was predicted by Jesus. The final verb in this particular set of verses is in verse 65, and it characterizes the whole scene of mockery. And for him it is blasphemy. Moreover, while these men blaspheme, Jesus says nothing at all. He is deprived of even his voice in this scene. Now remember, in chapter 12, verse 10, Jesus had warned that those who blaspheme against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. Luke now characterizes the acts of those who mocked Jesus and taunted the taunting criminal on the cross, which we'll see in chapter 23, are described as blasphemy. So at its roots, blasphemy is the act of scorning the sacred. Who would dare to taunt God or challenge the Lord's prophecy? This is what is being played out in this scene. It isn't just a scene of beating, but it is a reminder that these people are working in opposition to the will and the plan of God. They are acting as blasphemers, even though that is the charge that would ultimately be brought against Jesus himself. So with this beating, we now move to the first of Jesus' trials. This is his trial before the Sanhedrin or the council. Again, this is the Jewish leadership community. And this is chapter 22, verses 66 through 71. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And all of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they asked, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it from our own lips." So this is another scene that starts to fulfill the prophecies that Luke has been playing out throughout this gospel. So recognize there are no witnesses and no recitations of sayings about the destruction of the temple, nor formal verdict in this passage. Instead, this hearing is to prepare Jesus for the Roman courts rather than a formal trial. They're trying to find things they can use against him because they don't have the authority to kill him. So they've asked two questions, and they're both Christologians about the nature of who is the Messiah. And the first involves the title Christ or Messiah, and the second involves the title the Son of God. And both these titles are showing up not only in Luke but in the other Gospels. So in verse 66, in Luke and Acts, the council convenes early in the morning. We see this again on Acts chapter 4, verse 3, and chapter 5, verses 21 and 22. The group is composed of elders, chief priests, and scribes. Luke has recorded the maneuverings of the chief priests and scribes in several earlier passages in chapter 19, verse 47, in chapter 20, verse 1, and in chapter 22, verse 2. The elders have appeared also in chapter 20, verse 1, and 22, verse 52. But here it is, the council or the assembly of elders, the Sanhedrin, that is gathered. Jesus is not interrogated by the chief priests, but by the group as a whole. So the strategy of this council seems to be to goad Jesus into incriminating himself. But Luke's interest in this interaction is about the nature of Christ, Christology. So both questions involve titles that have already been clearly established for us as the readers. Jesus is already known to us to be the Messiah. We see that in the prophecies that came about John and about Jesus, about Elizabeth's song when Mary came to greet her, and about Mary's song herself, that he is the one, he is the chosen one, the anointed, the Messiah, the Christ. But according to the popular expectations of that day, the Messiah would have been a royal figure, and he would have been the one who would release the Israelites from their foreign oppressors. So by making such a confession, it would have been useful for the Sanhedrin before the Roman courts, because this would have been a challenge to the Roman authority in the community. So at his birth, remember, Jesus was announced as the Christ. He was the Messiah. He was the one chosen. And of course, later, Peter confessed that Jesus was the Messiah in chapter 9, verse 20. But at that time, Jesus ordered his disciples not to tell anyone. The royal overtones of this title are used as evidence, and they are lifted up and questioned in regarding to Jesus' relationship to David in chapter 20, verses 40 to 41. So even though Jesus responds, his answers are evasive and non-committal. So in this context, he could neither affirm nor deny the title. But they would not accept his answers, but they wanted him to be straightforward. They wanted to have a way to use his own words against him. But of course, neither would they answer him if he had questioned them. And he had done that, remember, as he confronted them in the temples, and they refused to answer in chapter 20, verses 5 through 8, and verse 26 and verse 40. Of course, in verse 69, Jesus introduces a third title, just as he had deflected Peter's confession that Jesus was the Christ by teaching them about the Son of Man in chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. Now what he had to say about the Son of Man was in the process of coming to pass. He was being rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, the same three groups of whom he had spoken on multiple occasions, chapter 9, verse 22, and chapter 22, verse 66. So Jesus starts looking ahead, and he affirms that the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And this is an Old Testament reference to Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13. One like a son of man, coming, the ancient one. And in Psalm 110, verse 1, who is seated at the right hand. So Jesus doesn't answer their direct questions, but he does make this proclamation that he is going to be seated at the right hand of God. He is the Son of Man that has been prophesied about in the Old Testament. So jumping on this, the council concludes that Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God. Again, they continue to seek incriminating words from Jesus and challenge his claim to this title. Now, the title Son of God is not used frequently in Luke, and it has not appeared at all in Luke since chapter 9. But this reference is the climactic one that demonstrates why the title could not be used openly. At the Annunciation, Jesus was designated the Son of God in chapter 1, verse 35. And his identity was confirmed from the voice from heaven at his baptism in chapter 3, verse 22, and again at the Transfiguration in chapter 9, verse 35. And although the devil tempted Jesus to prove that he was the Son of God in chapter 4, and the demons proclaimed his identity in chapter 4, verse 41, and again in chapter 8, verse 28, no one confesses Jesus as the Son of God in Luke. So all of this comes from other places and not from the people. So ironically, the council infers correctly what Jesus has said about the Son of Man, meaning that he is, or at least understands that he is, the Son of God. But they will not accept their own conclusion. So Jesus offers an equivocal response. You say that I am. He neither denies their deduction nor openly affirms it. The formula I am is used in the Gospel of John, but it echoes the divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3:14. But Luke's use of I am does not carry such overtones. Nevertheless, when Jesus replies, you say that I am, the reader may recall that Peter denied Jesus, saying, I am not. So at verse 71, this hearing concludes as the council underscores the weakness of their case against Jesus. All they have is Jesus' equivocal acceptance of their unbelieving confession that he is the Son of God. They said that they did not need any other testimony. Instead, the disciples would be the witnesses of these things in chapter 24, verse 48, and again in the book of Acts. This manipulation of Jesus, this attempt to get him to confess to something so that they can use it against him, ends up being a way that they just take what they want to hear and then they move to bring Jesus before Pilate. So Jesus now moves to his trial before Pilate in chapter 23, 1 through 5. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee, where he began even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he had heard that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some signs. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put on an elegant robe and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their command should be granted. He released the man they asked for, and the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and handed Jesus over as they wished. So now we find that the religious leaders are manipulating the scene, and they want Jesus put to death, and now are setting the stage as they deliver Jesus to Pilate and press Pilate for a guilty verdict. So this scene takes place in drama takes place in 5 scenes. First, Pilate's declaration of Jesus' innocence in verses 1 through 5. Jesus' appearance before Herod in verses 6 through 12. Pilate's second declaration of Jesus' innocence in 13 through 16. Fourth, Pilate's third declaration of Jesus' innocence in verses 18 through 22. And finally, Pilate's capitulation to the crowd in verses 23 through 25. So we see now that Jesus has been rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, as declared in chapter 9, verse 22, and is now handed over to human hands, which he declared in chapter 9, verse 44, and indeed to the Gentiles, as he predicted in 1832. The effect of this 5-part episode is to show that Jesus was innocent of the political charges brought against him. But less explicit, but no less important, is the sub-theme that God's redemptive purposes are being accomplished in spite of the travesty of Jesus' trial. The events of Jesus' betrayal and death are unfolding just as Jesus had predicted. Luke is bringing through all of the threads of prediction of all the teachings that Jesus shared with his disciples and the followers, of his charges against the leaders of the people for failing to see God's will and living up to God's plan for them. So let's walk through these 5 scenes. So the first one, Pilate's first declaration of Jesus' innocence. So again, we now move to another trial, and this scene is a trial before the Roman authority, Pilate. And notice that while Luke comments that the whole of the council delivered Jesus as one body, this was a combined force. Luke had noted earlier on that the scribes and the Pharisees were looking for charges to bring against Jesus, both in chapter 6 and chapter 11. Now they're accusing him of sedition. Whereas the interrogation before the council had primarily concerned religious matters, specifically Jesus' messiahship, the charges that they brought before Pilate are political. And although verse 2 may be read as containing 3 separate charges, perverting the nation, forbidding the payment of taxes, and proclaiming himself to be a king, the latter 2 charges probably define and substantiate the first. Jesus is therefore accused of sedition, the proof of which is his teaching regarding the payment of taxes and his statement regarding his messiahship. So from the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke, From the very beginning of the Gospel, Luke interpreted God's word in John the Baptist and Jesus as the fulfillment of the divine purpose for Israel. First, John was sent to turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God in chapter 1, verse 16. And in Jesus, the God of Israel has raised up a mighty Savior in the house of David, as declared in chapter 1, verses 68 through 69. Remember, even Simeon, who had been looking for the consolation of Israel, recognized that Jesus was the one who was sent to fulfill the promise of the glory of the people of Israel. This is in chapter 2, verses 52 and 32. And even during the Last Supper, Jesus had promised his disciples that they would sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel in chapter 22, verse 30. Jesus' accusers were right in seeing that Jesus' work had implications for the nation of Israel. But what was in fact redemption, they saw as perversion. Luke also prepared the reader to see that the 2 substantiating charges are false. When the scribes and the Pharisees asked Jesus whether they should pay taxes, he affirmed that they should do so in chapter 20, verses 25. And the relationship between the terms Messiah and King at the end of verse 2 is sufficiently ambiguous that various translations are possible. The Messiah, the King, Christ, a King, an anointed King. At his birth, Jesus was announced by the heavenly chorus as the Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord, in chapter 2, verse 11. The title King is not ascribed to Jesus until he approaches Jerusalem. And then he tells a story about a grasping worldly king in chapter 19, verses 11 through 27. And following which his disciples hailed him, corresponding to the angelic chorus at his birth with these words, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, glory in heaven, and glory in the highest heaven," in chapter 19, verse 38. Therefore, Jesus responds to political overtones of the expectations of a Messiah who would be David's son in chapter 1, verses 31 through 33. And he does this by citing Psalm 110, verse 1. To his disciples, he has explicitly renounced the ways of the King of the Gentiles in chapter 22. And unlike such kings, Jesus worked among them as one who serves. Remember when he washes his disciples' feet. As Luke tells it, when the Sanhedrin interrogated Jesus about his messiahship, and chapter 22, verse 67. They were looking for grounds to charge him with treason. They had failed to see that Jesus was the promised Savior, not a political schemer. Now, please note that Roman justice had no trial by jury. And since Jesus was not a Roman citizen, Pilate was free to handle the proceedings in any way he wished. There was no attorney for the defense. The judge interrogated the accuser and the witnesses, and the judge interrogated the accused, the accuser and the witnesses, and determined guilt or innocence, and mandated any punishment he deemed appropriate. So, using the charges brought by the religious authorities, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" in chapter 23, verse 3. Jesus' answer is equivocal as his answer to the Sanhedrin had been in chapter 22, verse 70. You say so. Still, it should probably not be read as a question. Immediately, Pilate announced to the chief priests, the council, and the crowds that he finds Jesus innocent of any crimes. Of course, the response by the chief priests, and it appears to be the crowd, is the repeat of the general charge against Jesus. And it's summarized in Luke's account of Jesus' ministry. He has stirred up the people by his teaching. Jesus taught in Galilee, in the villages, and in the temple. Luke uses the word Judea here in the general sense throughout all the lands of the Jews from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus has been spreading his teaching and arousing the people. Again, the people stand in a more positive light than the chief priests and the associates. The role of the crowd at the trial before Pilate, therefore, continues to be uncertain. So after this first declaration and Pilate not finding any reason to have Jesus arrested and having no charge, sends him to the local authority to be dealt with there, which is Herod. And Luke is the only gospel to report this scene of Jesus before Herod. When the chief priests informed Pilate that Jesus is from Galilee, Pilate seizes an opportunity to refer the case to Herod, and he was there for the Passover in Jerusalem. Herod hopes to see Jesus do a sign, but in the end, Jesus is sent back to Pilate for judgment. So verses 6 and 7 describe the transfer to Herod. The reference to Galilean in verse 6 picks up the allusion to Galilee in the previous verse. Peter and the other disciples are identified elsewhere in Luke and Acts as Galileans. Verse 7 is actually an inside view, the narrator's description of Pilate's mental process. Even though the claim was brought in Jerusalem, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod because Jesus is from his jurisdiction. Pilate may have decided upon this course of action in an effort to show deference to Herod and thereby repair the breach of their relationship, which was reported in verse 12. But it's more likely that Pilate simply hoped that Herod would act on the matter and therefore relieve Pilate of any responsibility. So the references in verse 7 and 12 at that time in that same day not only balance one another, but also underscore the historic significance of the events that were happening, in which neither Pilate nor Herod had any awareness. For Luke, it was more than merely the time of the Passover festival. Although Luke does not say so, one may conject that Pilate was staying in the Antonia fortress and Herod nearby in the residence built by his father, Herod the Great. The narrator again informs us of Herod's great joy at seeing Jesus and the reason for it. Herod had long wanted to meet Jesus and see him do a sign. Reports of Jesus' healing and exorcism had spread around Galilee, and when Herod heard the reports of what Jesus and his disciples were doing, he desired to see Jesus, as noted in chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. His desire to see a sign was not a request that Jesus do something to confirm the truth of his teachings, though. Herod was merely curious about the rumors he had heard and hoped that he might see something spectacular. Although Herod questioned Jesus at length, Jesus remained silent. Therefore, fulfilling Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, he remained silent before his accusers. The scribes and Pharisees who led Jesus to Pilate apparently followed him to Herod, where they continued to accuse Jesus. Now, Jesus' silence in front of Herod was affronting to Herod. While Jesus refused to answer, Herod allowed his soldiers to once again mock Jesus. Their mockery is directly related to the charges brought by the chief priests and the scribes, namely, that Jesus makes himself a king. Thus Herod and his soldiers dressed Jesus in an elegant robe and taunt him. Luke reports their derision with 3 participles: treated him with contempt, mocked him, and put a robe on him. Once again, the action of Jesus' adversaries fulfills his own prophecies. 3 things in Luke's narrative draw this scene to a close. First, Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate in verse 11. Compare the nearly identical language in verse 7 where Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. And second, Luke comments on the day in which these events occurred in verse 12, compared to the phrase "at that time" in verse 7. And third, Luke reports that Herod and Pilate, who had previously been adversaries, became friends as a result of these events. But even in this list, verse 12 is distinctive in that it introduces peripheral historical data that is not found elsewhere. Ironically, the events leading to Jesus' death already signal its reconciling effect. But Herod and Pilate are reconciling each other and not to God. Their reconciliation, therefore, is as hollow as Herod's worship of Jesus as a king had been. So once again, as mentioned, Jesus is sent back to Pilate, and this is Pilate's second time of declaring Jesus innocent in verses 13 through 16. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and he said to them, "You brought me this man as one who has perverted the people. And here I have examined them in your presence and have not found this man guilty of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and released." So Pilate is once again not seeing any reason to keep Jesus. And it is more subtle than first apparent. Pilate's second and third pronouncement of Jesus' innocence is broken by the interview by Herod. But yet Pilate continues to say there is nothing that is criminal about Jesus. So Jesus is declared innocent, but Pilate speaks this before the chief priests, the elders, and the people. The chief priests, the leaders, and the people. Now remember, the chief priests have been active throughout this arrest and trial of Jesus. And the leaders were only mentioned in chapter 14, verse 1. Yet the mention of the people is what attracts our attention in this section. Previously, the people have supported Jesus. Moreover, when the assembly of the leaders brought Jesus before Pilate, they had accused him of perverting our nation and stirring up the people. Now, when people recalls their charge against Jesus, he says, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people." In verses 2 and 14, there's a use of different verbs, but they're synonymous with perverting. Therefore, the religious leaders use more political designation of our nation when speaking to Pilate. He uses the more religious term, people of God, when addressing the chief priests. Calling together the people along with the leaders allows for the possibility that the people may now either convert or confirm the charge that the chief priests have brought against Jesus. Will they defend Jesus as the chief priests had feared earlier in chapter 22, verse 2, or will they confirm the allegations against him? When the people join the leaders in crying out, "Away with this fellow," in verse 18, it becomes clear that the chief priests, in fact, are the ones who have perverted the people. Pilate continues to review the proceedings to this point. He has already examined Jesus and pronounced him innocent. Therefore, no further interrogation is necessary. Moreover, he sent Jesus to Herod, who returned him. And as that action, Herod did not find Jesus guilty either. Consequently, Jesus has been tried by two judges independently, and each has declared that he is innocent, fulfilling the law of two witnesses in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. Pilate repeats his verdict. He has done nothing to deserve death. The emphasis on Jesus' innocence in this scene needs to be placed in its larger context. First, it is an important part of Luke's passion narrative. Luke reports of the charges against Jesus in chapter 23, verse 2. And in the earlier accounts of Jesus' teaching on the payment of taxes, prepares the reader to see immediately that the charges against Jesus are false. Then Jesus is declared innocent by both Pilate and, at least by implication, Herod. Later, the thief on the cross will defend Jesus' innocence, and the centurions will confirm, certainly this man was innocent. Later, the innocence of the apostles and Paul will be emphasized repeatedly in the book of Acts, demonstrating that Luke is concerned from beginning to end to demonstrate that the early Christians are innocent under Roman law. Whether Luke intends for his record to be used to convince Roman authorities of the innocence of Christians or to assure believers they have nothing to fear from the Roman authorities is less clear. Now, verse 16 is puzzling, but it's probably the first indication that Pilate will eventually succumb to the wishes of the leaders, the chief priests, and the leaders of the people. Flogging was not a mild chastisement. Pilate's words, as reported by Luke, contained an appalling euphemism. When read with the meaning that the verb piadou has other in context, Pilate's resolve will be that he will instruct or discipline Jesus. Flogging was a severe penalty and was only offered to those who were guilty. Nevertheless, Pilate has declared Jesus innocent, but now decides to have him flogged. Now, we could surmise that the flogging was an effort to appease Jesus' accusers. Luke actually never reports that a flogging was carried out, however. Verse 17 is omitted in many modern editions and translations. Manuscript evidence is divided. The verse appears to be a later effort to smooth out the text by alluding to the practice of releasing a prisoner at Passover, therefore bringing harmony of Luke with Mark, Matthew, and John. But verse 17 is not necessarily adding to the flow of the story, but it does explain the crowd's call for the release of Barabbas in verse 18. So while verse 17 is textually dubious, there is no reference to the practice outside, and there is no practice to the reference outside of the Gospels. The contention that the crowd could appeal for the release of the prisoner during a festival is credible in this context. So finally, we come to Pilate's third declaration of Jesus' innocence in verses 18 through 22. Then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow, release Barabbas for him." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate wanted to release Jesus and address them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. Excuse me. When the assembled crowds cried out in unison against Pilate's plan for a flogging and release, and then called for the release of Barabbas, Pilate addressed them for the third time. And for the third time, he affirms Jesus' innocence. This scene reproduces many of the details that are found in Mark, but the order and the language of Luke's account differs from Mark. Mark's claim that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to call for Barabbas rather than Jesus, but Luke does not say that. It was worked up by the leaders. The main difficulties posed for the interpreters of this section involve the release of Barabbas. What is the relationship between Pilate's declaration of Jesus' innocence and his hope to release Jesus and the crowd's call for the release of Barabbas? So again, looking at the textual uncertainty of verse 17, does Luke presume the practice of a release of a prisoner at Passover? If so, does Pilate hope to release Jesus because he is innocent? Or because by doing so, Pilate can avoid releasing Barabbas, who was actually guilty of insurrection and murder? So having introduced the people in verse 13, Luke does not further explain their sudden collusion with the chief priests and the leaders in calling for Jesus' death. In Mark, it is the chief priests are blamed for inciting the crowd. Yet, it is clear that the chief priests have played a role in the process of discrediting Jesus in Luke's gospel. It is they, in the end, who have perverted the nation. Now, further irony resides in the people's call for the release of Barabbas. Luke comments in verse 19 that Barabbas was guilty of insurrection. The council has brought Jesus to Pilate on political charges, but they end up calling for the release of the one who was guilty of the very crime in which they're attempting to pin on Jesus. Once again, Luke demonstrates Jesus' innocence by the way he tells the story. In rejecting the true Son of the Father, the crowd calls for the release of a man whose name means Son of the Father, Bar Abba, Barabbas, but whose actions, Barabbas' actions, clearly reflect a character who is not Son of the Father. Anyone who remembers Luke's reference to Jesus as the Son of God and Jesus' prayer to God as Father will not miss the irony here. Earlier, Jesus had predicted his death, and Luke reported that the authorities were looking for a way to put him to death. Crucifixion appears here for the first time in Luke's gospel. And it is done on the crowd's insistent cry of "Crucify him." Crucifixion was a gruesome form of execution. It was favored by Romans and known to have been practiced by the Hasmonean rulers in Palestine during the previous century. Josephus, the historian, reports that Alexander Jannaeus crucified 800 persons. Now remember, this is the third time, and Luke reminds us as such, that Pilate declares Jesus' innocence. 3 times Pilate addresses the crowd, and 3 times he proclaimed Jesus innocent, and 3 times Luke reports Pilate's intention to release Jesus. In the end, however, he will release another man and allow Jesus to be put to death. Pilate's second declaration that he will have Jesus flogged uses the same euphemism of disciplined as was used in verse 16. Pilate's last word in this gospel are his hollow declaration that he will release Jesus. In verses 23 through 25, we have Pilate's capitulation to the crowd. Verses 23 to 25 contain no direct discourse. They are instead the narrator's report of the outcome of Jesus' trial. The crowd kept pressing Pilate with loud cries to crucify him. Thus Pilate capitulated to their demand in verse 24 and handed Jesus over as they wished in verse 25. Each of these three verses underscores the crowd's responsibility for reversing Pilate's initial decision. After 3 times vowing to release Jesus, Pilate releases Barabbas instead. Luke's final word in this scene, however, concerned not Pilate, but the crowd. Pilate merely did as they wished in verse 25. We're going to draw our study to a close here. Let us review again the themes that we see played out. 1, God's redemptive purposes. Definitely, as Jesus had predicted many times, the redemptive act is starting. This process is in place. How about 2, salvation for all alike? No, that's not being lifted up in this particular stories. How about 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth? This was not part of our stories today either. How about 4th, table fellowship? Not in this gathering of stories. How about 5, the role of a disciple? Well, we definitely see what's not in play, right? We see the crowd turning away, being influenced by the council, the leaders, the chief priests, to turn their backs on Jesus. So the role of a disciple is not being lifted up here. But 6, the importance of an accurate witness. Again, Luke's goal is to make sure that the story he shares is an accurate witness of what is happening. And once again, using Old Testament, using the prophecies that Jesus had lifted up earlier in Luke, Luke continues to emphasize how this is the fulfillment, the prophecy of the Old Testament and the prophecies of Jesus' trial and mocking and charges are coming to fulfillment. He is bringing it all together. So his accurate witness is being lifted up. And as we conclude our studies, I want you to know that we will be moving now into the crucifixion of Jesus. And we'll be in chapter 23, verses 26 to 43 for the crucifixion itself. We'll discuss the death of Jesus in chapter 23, verses 44 through 49, and the burial of Jesus in chapter 23, verses 50 to 56. So once again, brothers and sisters, thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, reflections, comments, put them in the comment section below. But again, if you prefer a more private conversation, you can reach out to me via email or my social media. All of that will post here momentarily. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.